Well, good morning, y'all. We are in the middle of a series entitled Revision, because as we start this new year, that's exactly what a lot of us need, is kind of a new vision for our lives, a new perspective about what is possible, and to really redefine our lives, about what our lives is going to be about moving forward. But before we can move forward, we have to get out of the past. And so that's what we've been dealing with for the last couple weeks. And today we are discussing moving past resentment, which should be a really fun message. So I'll start out with this. How many of you would say, and I want to see a show of hands, all right? How many of you would say that you have people in your lives who have hurt you or wronged you in some way, or did something that upset you, and that person has truly hurt maybe you or somebody else, and you, in your head, you don't really care whether you see that person for as long as you live again? Like, how many of you would say, yeah? All right. So look around. We're all on the same page here, right? How many of you would say that you have harbored bad feelings towards somebody at some time in your life, and to the point that they've done something to you that every time you think about it, you just get upset? How many of you would admit, I want to see a show of hands, that deep down in your heart, you have ever secretly wished that something bad would happen to that person? Just as I thought. You people are evil people. It's a good thing you got your butt in church this morning, I'm telling you. Look, everybody deals with resentment. It's like a normal thing. We don't really like to talk about it a lot, but it's a human nature. And I'm somebody who prides himself on, being a person that doesn't hold a grudge and, forgives people. And the truth is, when I get a true assessment of my heart and I dig deep, I've got some resentment there that I've never dealt with, that I should probably deal with at some point. And I just got to let go of it. So we all deal with it. And today, I just want to talk about, what does it look like to get this resentment out and to really be able to let it go, so that we can experience a life of joy and love instead of one that is bitter. So the book of Hebrews actually gives us a good image of this, because it says in Hebrews chapter 12, it says, make sure that nobody misses out on God's grace. Make sure that no even hint of root of bitterness grows up that might cause trouble and pollute other people. So I think the Bible is clear in warning that bitterness is something that can grow in our hearts, and it can eat at us to the point that we don't experience the grace of God. We don't experience the joy of life, and it can also not only poison us, but it can poison the people around us. So how does this bitterness take root? Well, bitterness, I think, grows in the soil of a hurt that hasn't been dealt with properly. A bitter root grows within the soil of a deep wound that has never healed. And those bitter roots continue to grow deeper and deeper until we can get down low enough to the bottom of these things and rip them out so that it doesn't grow back. I started looking in the Bible for somebody who had a hard time with resentment, and you'll never believe who I found. Ironically, it's somebody who is described as one of the great men of the Bible, King David. Now, I have to tell you that David gives me hope for my own messed up life, because no matter how bad of things I've done or you've done, David has done them all and then some. and yet he is still described as a man after God's own heart. So keep hope alive. But it seems that David had a bit of a resentment problem on top of all of his other issues. And he had this son named Absalom. And instead of the great father-son relationship that David or any father really dreams about, it became a relationship of pain. And to make a very long story short, Absalom turned against his own father. He wanted to make a run for the throne, and so he raises an army to overthrow his own father and kick him out of the kingship so that he himself can take over the throne. But David could not bear the thought of fighting against his own son. And so he made a very difficult decision, and he chose to run. To face the humiliation of retreating from Absalom instead of fighting against his own son. And as David and his men are fleeing the palace and leaving town, I am sure he must have thought, it just can't get any worse than this. But it does. And in 2 Samuel chapter 16, here's what happens. As King David approached Bahurim, a man from the same clan as Saul's family came out from there, and his name was Shimei, son of Gera. And he cursed David as he came out. He pelted David and all the king's officials with stones, though all the troops and special guard were on David's right and on his left. And as he cursed, Shimei said, "Get out, you murderer, you scoundrel. The Lord has repaid you for all the blood you shed in the household of Saul, in whose place you have reigned. The Lord has given the kingdom into the hands of your son Absalom. You have come to ruin because you are a murderer." So here's this guy, Shimei, who absolutely hates David. There's some history there that we can't get into this morning, but Shimei had a little bit of a resentment problem himself, right? And as David is fleeing town, Shimei chases David and his men down, and he starts pelting them with rocks and dirt clods, and he's yelling out, derogatory things and screaming insults and humiliating David, saying that he is getting what he deserved. Now, for somebody to say or to do those things to a king in that day and age would mean almost certain death, right? And in fact, one of David's men goes after Shimei and says, "Why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Let me go over and cut off his head." Now, see, that's one way you deal with resentment. You just cut the head off the thing. It's clean. It's one approach. But the king says, what does this have to do with you? Is he cursing you? He's cursing me, because the Lord said to him, "Curse David." And who can ask, why do you do this? And David then said to all his officials, "My son, my own flesh and blood, he's trying to kill me. How much more then is this Benjamite?" A lot of people, I don't think, like David. "Leave him alone. Let him curse, for the Lord has told him to. It may be that because of this, the Lord will look upon my misery and restore to me his covenant blessing instead of the curse that I'm experiencing today." So, David shows great restraint here, right? He says, don't kill him. Maybe I am getting what I deserve. It feels like a very humble moment that David is experiencing. And, he's saying that, he literally in that moment could have had Shimei pay with his life like that just to give the order. But instead he lets him go. However, as David lets Shimei off the hook, Shimei couldn't let go of it. And he takes advantage of David's good nature, and it says that as David and his men continued along the road, while Shimei was going along the hillside opposite him, cursing, throwing stones. Now he's showering him with dirt. I just imagine him picking up big piles of dirt and throwing it on the king. It had to be incredibly humiliating. So, this guy's a real pest. I probably would have had him killed if I had the power. Now, when you hear that story, though, you go, David really handled himself pretty well, right? How many think David's done a good job here? Yeah, right? He's kind of handled this whole thing well. Even later, we read that after David takes his throne back from his son, he's sitting on the throne, Shimei goes, oh crap, now look what I've done, I better go fix this. And so he throws himself upon the mercy of David in 2 Samuel chapter 19, verse 18, and begs him for forgiveness, begs him for mercy, which David gives him. And in fact, in this moment, he actually goes one step further, and David makes an oath and says, you will never, ever be killed. You will never be put to death. The problem was that while David let Shimei go, he never, ever let go of the resentment that he had against him. And so this story is a long way from being over. But the question that I have for you this morning, who is your Shimei? Who do you have a resentment for that you've just never, ever been able to let go of that? We've all been on the receiving end of hurts and insults, and they're not easy to forget, are they? Whether we like it or not, they have an effect on us. Take a minute, ask yourself the question, who is my Shimei? Who do I have some unfinished business with? Who am I holding on to resentment for? For some of us, our Shimei is one or both of our parents. And we have a long family history of pain. And we get frustrated just even thinking about our mom or dad because they've always been critical, or we've never been able to measure up, or they've been abusive. For others of us, you are sleeping with your Shimei. Your Shimei is your husband or your wife. Things have gone south, and your relationship has become a relationship of resentment. An interviewer once asked Billy Graham's wife, have you ever thought about divorce? And she thought about it for a minute, and she said, divorce? No. Murder once or twice. Resentment takes root over time. It's that bitter root that Hebrews is talking about, and it goes deeper and deeper, and we don't deal with it with our husband and wife. We let it build up, and it slowly grows through the years until we feel very alone in our marriage. Others of us have gone through a divorce, and our ex-husband or our ex-wife is our Shimei. You feel betrayed, you feel wounded, you feel angry, and the bitterness just builds up inside you. Look, there's a million other possibilities of people who could have hurt us or abused us in some way, and so now we end up with a resentment problem. Whatever it is that's in your past, typically most of us have some deep emotional wounds that has caused our hearts to shrink up and become bitter for that person. We never forget, and they become our Shimei. Well, we know that David had a hard time letting go of resentment because, as I said, that's not the end of the story. So skip ahead to 10 years later. King David is on his deathbed. He has this beautiful moment with his youngest son Solomon, who's about to take over as king. And so David says all of these beautiful things to him that you'd want to have a father say to a son. You know, you're about to take over the kingship, so son, you're going to have to be strong. Son, you're going to have to stay close to God. Make sure you always maintain your relationship with God. And just before David dies, he says, oh yeah, there's just one more thing. He says, there's just one little piece of business that I need you to take care of for me. Do you remember that guy, Shimei, who cursed me and threw stones at me and humiliated me that day several years ago. Solomon's like, yeah. He's like, well, when he came down to meet me at the Jordan, he threw himself on my mercy, and I felt compassion for him, and so I swore to the Lord that I would not put him to death. But now, son, do not consider him innocent. So when David says, remember that day, do you think that somehow this just kind of happenstancingly popped into his head? No. That day, he remembers like it was yesterday, and it's been killing him for years. It's been sticking with him. And my guess is that he has been playing that day of Shimei throwing rocks at him and cursing at him over and over and over again like a bad movie. And so now, on his deathbed, he says to his son Solomon, son, you are a man of wisdom, and you will know exactly what to do with him. And in case you don't, let me tell you what to do with him. You bring his gray beard down to the grave in blood. Dang, that is harsh. David resented Shimei so much that getting even with him was literally the last thing on his mind. And sadly, those were David's last bitter words. Can you imagine how deep David's resentment must have gone, how the bitterness must have built up year after year, to come to the point of ordering somebody's death as your last act on this earth? I mean, it's crazy. David had a resentment for Shimei that he could never, ever let go of. Someone once said, holding on to resentment is like gripping a hot coal in our hands with the intention of throwing it at somebody, but we're the ones who get burnt. I think that's incredibly insightful. Resentment burns deep inside of us, and it takes hold of us, and it creates a bitterness, a bitter root inside of us, to the point that you can almost hear the sucking sound as resentment sucks the joy and peace right out of our lives. Who is your Shimei? The resentment problem, I think, comes down to a decision that we make, and because when it comes to resentment, we have a choice. We can either retain it and keep it hidden in our heart and not deal with it, or we can process it and release it and be free of it. And most of us, either consciously or unconsciously, we retain it. And some of us retain it, most of us retain it by stuffing it and never ever dealing it. And you can shove this stuff down as deep as you want, and you can convince yourself that there really is no problem there. But if you stuff your hurt like that, I promise you this, it will show up again. And usually it pops up in the most unhealthy ways. It shows up again where you have unnecessary stress and you don't even know why. Or physical problems like ulcers, anxiety. It causes you to become angry. You become rageful and you don't even know why you're doing that. At the smallest things. Because you have stuffed it to the point that it just has to always pop up, and it pops up again and again and again, one way or another. A sign that we're retaining resentment is that with certain hurts, we not only remember them, but we rehearse them in our head. Just like David with his Shimei. Not only did he remember what Shimei did, but it played over and over and over again in the DVR of our hearts and minds. And like a scab, the more we pick at the pain, the more we bleed and the less we are able to heal. Another sign that we're retaining resentment is that we have a desire to retaliate against the source of our bitterness. Now, most of us don't have the option that David did, have Shimei put to death, and don't get any ideas about that. But we do the little things, don't we? We can go negative on somebody. We can talk some junk about people. We can start rumors. We can talk behind their back. We can put them down every chance we get. I don't know anything more fundamental to our humanity than the desire to hurt somebody back for hurting us. It's pretty basic. It's a natural response. I'll tell you this. I had a business situation just this last week. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a real estate developer, actually. And so just this last week, I had a situation where I needed to get something for the city of Chicago on an ordinance issue on one of my developments downtown. And the neighboring business, I needed their sign off on it. It had no negative impact to them. They just needed to consent. And the neighboring business owner sees his opportunity to take advantage of me and to extort some money out of me for what I needed. Now, let me tell you, this really ticked me off. I was pretty mad. And so I figured out a way that I could work around him, and to the point that I didn't need him. So I was able to design around this particular piece of the property, and I did that. So we designed around it, and I didn't need this guy. But I got to tell you this, speaking as your pastor, it wasn't 30 seconds after I figured out I could get by without even needing him that I was like, nah, take that. And by the way, 4 years from now, when you come back to me needing the same thing that I needed from you, I figured out ways that I could stick it to him. This is the darkness inside my head. Are you not proud to be a Westridger right now? I got to tell you. And by the way, it's all while I'm like this week writing a message on resentment. It's ridiculous. So I'm going to move on to David and show you how bad his life is. So here's how it ends up for old Shimei. After David dies, his son Solomon becomes king. And as one of his first acts as king, I can't go into all the details, but basically Solomon figures out a loophole to catch Shimei in a loophole with David's oath so he could actually find a way to take him out without breaking his father's oath. And when he seizes on that opportunity and takes advantage of it, Solomon, even though he is legally killing him for something else, he calls Shimei in and he says, however, you know in your heart the wrong that you did to my father David, and now the Lord will repay you for your wrongdoing. And the king gave the order, and one of his men took him out. Crazy stuff. David gets his revenge from the grave, but he passes on a legacy of resentment to his kid. What kind of legacy are we passing on when we're dealing with that? How we talk about the people that have wronged us? What kind of image are we giving our kids and model? Here's the truth. We will never, ever break the cycle of resentment until we can release the person who has wronged us from what they've done. You see, forgiveness is relinquishing the right to hurt someone back, even if they deserve it. It's releasing it to God and refusing to say that sarcastic comment, or to give that dirty look, or to put that person down. every time we have the chance to hurt somebody who has hurt me, and we pass it up, I'm getting closer to healing. I'm getting closer to releasing that root of bitterness. And pride is probably the biggest barrier to healing, because to give honest, heartfelt forgiveness is coming to a place in our lives of humility with no pride or no ego, no strings attached, just a simple act of forgiveness. And it's only then that healing can begin. Here's the most important truth I want you to hear this morning in dealing with resentment. The best remedy for dealing with this is to remember that I really am no better than anybody else. And I have done some things in my life. And here's the hard part. There's a really good possibility that I am somebody else's Shimei. And yet I have been forgiven. In my own messed up life, I have received grace. I'm not forgiven because I deserve it, or because I'm any better than anybody else, or because what I've done is any worse or better than anybody else. I am forgiven because I have a God who loves me unconditionally. You see, when we finally get how much we mean to God and how much He loves us, we can then begin to understand how He loves every other person, including our Shimei. The Bible says, he who has been forgiven much loves much and is able to forgive and release others from what they've done. I've been hurt pretty deeply in my life at times from people I have loved in my life. And I have learned that the people that we love the most are the people that hurt us the most deeply. And I have had to do and continue to do the hard work to release that stuff. Because if I don't, I know it will eat me up inside. That root of bitterness will continue to grow, and I don't want the last breath that I take on this earth to be a bitter one. Healing and recovery from resentment does not come easy. It doesn't come overnight. It just happens one step at a time. And I do believe that with time and with God, anything is possible. And God promises that if we can just put it in His hands and just release it to Him, that He will give us the strength to move past our resentment and our pain, so that one day we will be able to give grace to our Shimei, the same grace that we ourselves have received.